Good evening, good afternoon. I hope that your afternoon was as productive as mine. I watched a little television and studied a little Word of God, and it just seems that it's been a great day to get to do nothing. You know how wonderful that is when there's nothing that has to be done, except I do have a TV in my car that needs to be unloaded. If some of you guys help David unload it, because I hurt my back getting it loaded, but I'll be okay. This morning in our Bible class, we were discussing Galatians chapter 5 and 6. And Galatians to me is one of those great books because it does such a simple job in taking the gospel in what sometimes we perceive in its complexities and distilling it down to something that is usable, that is something that is applicable to us, that we can understand and we can carry with us. In fact, Galatians is a perfect synopsis of not just the gospel in order to be saved, but really the gospel and how we should live. It is a pattern for the church of Christ, which He has instituted and designed for our fellowship and for our growth, for our salvation and for our strength as Christians. And you don't have to read very far in Galatians before you realize that being part of one another's lives is an important part of Christianity. And we talked about this in my Bible class this morning, and I'm sure something similar in the other Bible classes. But notice in there where it says that we love one another. The Bible talks about serving one another. The Bible talks about encouraging one another. And so sometimes we picture that church is a place where each individual comes in isolation and we draw near and close to one another, but we each lead these separate and distinct lives that are separated and different from one another. And while there is some individualism, what the Bible actually shows is that we as Christians ought to come together and be involved with one another. We're not individual in isolation, but we are involved in one another's lives. That our love and our concern for one another draws us closer together. And you think about a church in which Christians are involved in one another's lives and concerned about one another. We saw it last week when we were looking at Acts chapter 2 when they were selling all that they had so that everyone would have what they needed. You know, how do we know when someone is in need? How do we know when someone in the church is hurting? How do we know that someone in the church is celebrating? Well, the answer is we are involved in one another's lives. And so there's this picture that is painted throughout the book of Galatians, but really through all of the New Testament and even in the Old Testament, that God's people ought to be concerned one for another. That we take interest in and involve in one another's lives. And so it's difficult for us sometimes because we think, well, this is my business. No one really needs to know about this. Or I don't really want everyone to know about this. And we shield ourselves from having our lives involved by others. And yet, just as the Bible tells us to love one another, that means not only do we go to others and try to show love and concern for them and be involved in their lives, but that we also are willing to open our lives to be involved with. And then in chapter 6, there's this portrait that is painted for us about this involved life. In 3 verses, chapter 6, verse 2, verse 5, in verse 17, there's a word that is used that's translated as bear or carry or lift up. In verse 2 he says that we are to bear one another's burdens. We read that and we instantly see that there is an involvement in the lives of other Christians. That we recognize there are struggles and trials and burdens that we have to bear. He uses the word burden here. And it's interesting because a lot of the book of Galatians has been dealing with the legalistic, pharisaical attitude of trying to bind the old Jewish law. In fact, I can see a lot of hints of Pharisees in the Judaizing teachers. Now, I can't guarantee that every Judaizing teacher was a Reformed Pharisee, or maybe we should say a Reforming Pharisee, but they have a lot of the same similarities. I find it interesting that in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 4, Jesus, in talking about the scribes and the Pharisees, He says that they tie upon you burdens that are heavier than you should bear, and yet they will not lift a finger or move a finger to help lift that load. You see, the Pharisees were good about teaming up together maybe and only being involved in one another's lives, but really not involving themselves in the lives of Israel. And even among them, their own selves, they would often distance themselves. You think about Nicodemus, who came to Jesus by night, and when he stood up for Jesus, and I say almost stood up for Jesus in John chapter 7. And ultimately, whenever he goes and he requests the body of Jesus, he's doing that in isolation from the Pharisees and the other members of the council. They don't know of his dealings. And so there's very much an isolationism, because in the Pharisees, if I'm right, good on me. And if you're right, I just haven't looked hard enough. That was mostly their attitude. And so they were all about picking at people and laying burdens, as Jesus said, tying burdens on them that were heavier than one could bear, and then not even trying to help them lift it. What a sad commentary on their lives. And yet look what Jesus, or what Paul is saying here. Bear one another's burdens. That is so different than the tying of the burdens by the Pharisees, or the tyings of the burdens of the Judaizing teachers trying to require them to do more. He says, instead of living your life in trying to bind burdens upon other people, why not come in concern and lift one another's burdens? I mentioned the TV in my car. It's one that we bought several years ago, so it's not a flat screen or anything. It's one of those big glass tube televisions. And it's not really big, but I got to tell you, it's heavy. And when you pick it up, the first thing it wants to do is roll over. And how much easier is it to take that TV and get 2 people or 3 people or even 4 people to carry it? It's the same burden. It doesn't weigh more or less when you've got 2 or 3 or 4 people handling it. But the more people you have, the lighter the burden comes. And so it is in Christian living. We all have burdens that we have to bear. Sometimes they're the consequences of our past life of sin, and we're still having to bear those consequences. Sometimes it's dealing with other people that don't like our Christianity or don't like our faith. Sometimes it's the consequence of the decisions that we make right now. We make bad decisions sometimes. And oftentimes when we make bad decisions, or we see someone making bad decisions, we want to say, well, that's their own fault. They're in that predicament because of the choices they made. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. But if we had made bad choices and we need help getting out of that predicament, don't we want someone that would love us and be concerned about us to come and help lift that burden? Sure we would. He calls us to bear one another's burdens, in contrast to the Judaizing teachers who were trying to bind burdens, in this case the burden of circumcision, but the burden really of the whole law. If you bind one part of the law, you got to bind the whole part of the law, or the whole of the law. So they're trying to bind this burden, put them under, as he described, a yoke of slavery in chapter 5 and verse 1. And so we want the freedom, but with that freedom comes the idea that we've got to be concerned and involved in one another's lives and lift those burdens. And there's many ways we can lift those burdens. We can start by praying for those who are in need. Praying that they would make better decisions. Yes. Praying that they can get out of the consequence and circumstance they're in. Yes, absolutely. Praying that grace might be shown to them in the midst of their turmoils. Yeah. But we can also go and actually say words of encouragement to them. Speak with them. We can go and offer our help. We can pray that their hearts would be open to our hands. Think about that. Not just praying that their service might, or their burden might be alleviated, but how we are that kind of a private person. Pray that they might open their hearts to us and accept the help that we can offer. Sometimes maybe we're not the ones that can help, but we know someone who can. So there's a lot of ways that we can help lift that burden. The last thing we want to do is go and sit in the middle of the burden and say, carry me as well. As we mock them or make fun of them or say, well, you got yourself into this mess. They often know that. They need help getting out of it. In verse 5, though, after he tells them, he says, look, you which are spiritual are restoring such a one. You're bearing one another's burdens. And if you think you're that great, if you think you're everything that you think you are, take a good look at yourself from God's eyes, and you'll recognize that we all have these problems. We all have these struggles. And in the end, in verse 5, he says, for each one of us will what? Bear our own burdens. It's interesting. He uses a different word for burden here. Fortion is the word that is used here. It was a word which in times before the first century was used in reference to the cargo load of a ship. It's kind of interesting because the first one is a word that was used for weights of a balance. You can think of a balance scale and the weights that might be used there, and you may have 10, 20, 40, maybe 50 pounds, and you're using those to balance on the scale. Compare that to the cargo hold of a ship and what it can hold. And he says, we have to bear our own burdens. What's interesting is by the first century, this word fortion came to be known as a soldier's pack, his rucksack, you might say. And everything that he had to carry in that sack was what he needed to survive in the wilderness. He might carry his bedroll, he might carry a tent, he might carry rations, might carry water. Those are the things that he needed to survive. And if he left those things out, he would not be able to survive. Verse 5 is talking about the fact that on the day of judgment, we've got to carry our own burdens. We are involved in one another's lives, and we help lift the burden. But ultimately, on the day of judgment, we each must carry whatever burden we've made in this life. He is going to render unto every man according to his works. Matthew 16 and verse 27. The works which we have done in this life are going to be put upon us like a packed mule. And when we stand before God, we will be judged according to the works which we have done. We go to Revelation 20. Where we're standing, all of us, standing before the judgment throne of God. And the books were open in the Lamb's book of life, and each one is judged according to his deeds. That's our burden. That's the load that we are carrying on the day of judgment. We go back to this morning's lesson from 2 Thessalonians 1. We must know God and obey the gospel if we're to escape the flaming fires of Jesus. That's the burden that we carry. Have I obeyed the gospel? Have I submitted my life to Christ in faith, trusting in Him and not in myself to be saved and receive the grace of God? Have I obeyed the gospel? Do I know God and His will for my life and His design for me, not only as a Christian, but just as a human being? Have I reached out to those around me in the church and even outside the church with service and love and being willing to bear one another's burdens? You see, these questions I've got to answer, and those answers are going to go with me to the judgment day. And will I be able to stand under the burden which I have to carry there? There's an idea in 1 Peter 5 and verse 7 that we cast our cares and our burdens at the feet of Jesus, who is able to lift us up on the day of judgment and allow us to be fit for the kingdom of heaven. So, in our involvement as Christians, we bear one another's burdens. That's going to lead to whether or not we bear our own burdens in verse 5. And then notice verse 17. In which Paul says that from now on let no one cause me trouble, for I bear in my body the marks of Jesus. Again, it's the same word, to carry or to lift off. And there's this picture of Paul saying that I have these marks on my body. And I think Paul is referring to the scars of the times that he was whipped and beaten, flogged, stoned, and left for dead. Do you think those actions don't leave marks on the body? I've got scars on my arm from barbed wire fences. Wasn't near as brutal as a stoning. I've got a scar on my nose from a rock that I fell on as a child. I bear in my body the marks of just living life on this earth because we have accidents, we stumble, we fall, we cut ourselves, we break things, right? Paul's saying, look at my life. Look, don't let anyone put me down. My life, I bear in my body these marks of Christianity that I have suffered for Christ. Five times, he said, I was beaten with 40 stripes minus one. Can you imagine how that tears the flesh? What kind of scar that would leave? But I don't think that Paul is just saying it's only the scars of his physical body, but it is the marks of his emotional life. He would say at the end of that passage in 2 Corinthians 11 that besides those things which are without, there's that which presses on me from within, the anxiety and the care of all the churches. There's emotional scars. And you look at Paul's life and Jesus' life, and you see that in a lot of ways he lived like Jesus. I know Jesus was perfect, but even though Paul wasn't perfect, he strove for that perfection to live like him. Be imitators of me as I'm an imitator of Christ. He loved like Jesus. He saw how Jesus loved his fellow man, and he strove in his life to love like Jesus did. He served like Jesus did. There is a resemblance in his life that marked him as a Christian. And it was something that he said that I have to bear, that I carry with me every day of my life. And as a result, then, he is called to endure like Jesus. Some have called this the three little bears of Galatians 6. But these aren't little. This is at the crux of Christianity. That in this life we involve ourselves with one another and carry one another's burdens to help each one of us live closer and closer to God. Realizing that in the end I've got to bear my own burden. I've got to carry it before God and allow myself to be judged according to His Word. And then seeking ways in which Jesus may be marked in my life. That word marked, by the way, comes from the same word that is used in Romans 6:17 about mark those which cause divisions. And the idea is to make note of them. Let's make note of Christ in our lives. Because the only Bible that some may read is the life that you lead. And I hope that each of us determine to carry these burdens to the glory of God, to the salvation of others. And maybe you've never put on Christ. Maybe that's a burden you're yet to pick up. To call yourself a Christian, not just say I'm a Christian, but to call yourself a Christian because you've obeyed the gospel, because you know Him and you know God. If you've not done that, there's, as kindly as I can say it, there's no hope for heaven for you without obeying the gospel. All the good works, all the kind words, all the encouragement, no matter how many burdens you may lift of your fellow man, without obeying the gospel, there's no hope of salvation. So if you haven't done that, please get that taken care of tonight. Don't leave here thinking, I'll put it off a little bit longer. Let's do it tonight. And if you're a Christian, maybe you've slidden back a little bit, you've been distracted by the world, or maybe you're just struggling with sin and you need strength, you need prayers, you need encouragement from those that are here. Open your life to involvement by those around you that love you. If you have a need tonight, we ask that you would respond to heaven's invitation while we stand and while we sing.